Good evening and welcome back to the channel. There is a diplomat right now who has not slept properly in weeks. His name is Ishaq Dar. He is Pakistan's foreign minister, and in the last 3 days alone, he has flown to Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey. He has sat across from kings, emirs, and prime ministers. He has carried messages between Washington and Tehran through back channels so quiet they do not appear in any press briefing, any official statement, or any headline you have read this week. This is shuttle diplomacy at the highest level, not the kind you read about in history books after the fact, the kind happening right now in real time on a ticking clock. And when Dar finally landed back in Islamabad, he had one job, one singular, urgent, everything depends on it job: get Iran back to the negotiating table before the ceasefire expires on Tuesday. Today, Iran told him no, not maybe, not yet, not we need more time. No, Iran's answer was clean and absolute. No talks until a framework is agreed upon first. A framework that Iran has not described in writing and that America has not publicly named. And while Dar was sitting with that answer, absorbing what it meant, calculating what came next, something else happened that almost nobody is talking about. China went silent. China, which has been the single most diplomatically active external power throughout this entire conflict, issued no statement, made no phone call, expressed no public position. On the day it mattered most, with the clock running down and the ceasefire 3 days from expiring, China said absolutely nothing. I want to explain what that silence means, because I think it tells you more about where this war is actually heading than anything being said out loud by any official in any capital in any press conference right now. But before I get to China, I need to address something. Because the way this story is being covered is missing something fundamental, something that changes the entire picture once you see it. Iran's refusal is being reported as stubbornness, as bad faith, as a country playing dangerous games with a ceasefire clock while people's lives hang in the balance. If you have only been reading the headlines, that is the conclusion you would naturally draw. Iran is being difficult. Iran is the obstacle. If Iran would just come to the table, a deal could happen. That framing is wrong, and I want to show you exactly why. Because once you understand what Iran is actually doing and why it is doing it, China's silence stops looking like an absence. It starts looking like a policy. And that policy is the real story of what is happening today. Let's start with Iran's refusal, because I think it is being badly misread. The coverage is treating Iran's refusal to negotiate as irrational obstinacy. Some outlets are calling it a deliberate bad faith move, designed to run out the clock before Tuesday's deadline. The narrative being constructed is simple. Iran is the problem. Iran is the obstacle. If Iran would just cooperate, peace could happen. But here is what that narrative leaves out. Iran's refusal is not irrational. It is a strategic calculation rooted in lived experience. And to understand that calculation, you have to understand what Iran actually experienced in the last round of talks. 21 hours. That is how long the Islamabad negotiations ran. The highest level direct meeting between the United States and Iran since the 1979 Islamic Revolution. On one side of the table, Vance, Witkoff, and Kushner. On the other, Ghalibaf and Araghchi, Pakistani mediators in the room, cameras outside, the weight of history pressing down on everyone present. And at the end of 21 hours, Iran walked out without a deal. Iran's parliamentary speaker, Mohammad Baghir Ghalibaf, spoke publicly afterward. I want you to hear what he actually said. Not the paraphrase, not the headline summary, but his words. Before the negotiations, I emphasized that we have the necessary good faith and will, but due to the experiences of the 2 previous wars, we have no trust in the opposing side. My colleagues raised forward-looking initiatives, but the opposing side ultimately failed to gain the trust of the Iranian delegation. Read that again carefully. He is not describing a capability gap. He is not describing a military imbalance. He is describing a trust deficit. Iran does not believe America will honor an agreement, and Iran has specific documented historical reasons for that belief. America signed the JCPOA, the nuclear deal, in 2015. America tore it up in 2018, unilaterally, without Iran violating a single term. America helped negotiate the first ceasefire in this war, and then imposed a blockade during the ceasefire period itself. America's own president told reporters that Iran had agreed to everything, and Iran's foreign ministry issued a public statement calling those claims false. Galabaf said the two delegations came within inches of a deal before America shifted the goalposts. Iranian Foreign Minister Araghchi made the same claim independently, inches away, and then the framework changed. U.S. officials, speaking privately, confirmed that real progress had been made. One source told Reuters the two sides were 80% of the way to an agreement. 80%. Iran got closer to a nuclear deal with America than at any point in the last 50 years. And then, with the finish line in sight, the terms moved. So now Iran is telling Pakistan, before we sit down again, we need a framework agreed upon in writing. Not verbal assurances, not promises made across a table, because verbal assurances from America have a very specific track record with Iran. And that track record goes back decades. That is not stubbornness. That is a country that has been burned badly, repeatedly, and recently, and is refusing to put its hand back on the stove without some guarantee that the burner is off. Now let's talk about America's claim that talks are happening this weekend, because most coverage is accepting this at face value, and I think that is a significant mistake. Look at the pattern across this entire conflict. Trump said Iran agreed to everything. Trump said talks were imminent. Trump said the Strait of Hormuz was open. And within 24 hours, Iran had closed it again and IRGC gunboats had fired on a tanker. The gap between what Trump says Iran has agreed to and what Iran's own government says is not noise. It is not simply a communication problem or a translation issue or diplomatic spin. It is information. And what it tells you is this: America's negotiating position consistently requires Iran to publicly concede things Iran has not publicly conceded. When America says Iran agreed to suspend uranium enrichment, Iran's foreign minister goes on television and says the uranium is not going anywhere. When America says the Strait of Hormuz is open for business, Iran's supreme leader posts on Telegram about bitter defeats that still need to be answered. When America says talks are happening this weekend, Iran tells Pakistan there will be no talks without a framework agreed first. I am not saying the talks will not happen. Pakistan, Egypt, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia are all still working the phones, still shuttling between Washington and Tehran, still trying to find the precise combination of words that gets both sides back to the same table. Axios reported that mediators remain genuinely confident a deal is still possible. The ceasefire, despite everything, is technically still holding on the Iran-US front, even as Hormuz fluctuates and tensions stay dangerously elevated. A deal before Tuesday is not impossible, but America's silence in direct response to Iran's refusal, no press conference, no formal statement naming what America does next if talks don't materialize by Tuesday, is itself a choice. And that choice communicates something very specific. Not to Iran, to China. This is the part I want to spend the most time on, because the China dimension of today's events is genuinely underreported, and I think it is genuinely the most important thing happening right now. In international relations, silence from a major power is never simply the absence of a statement. Silence is a statement. The question is always who is reading it and what they understand from it. China has positioned itself throughout this conflict as the most consequential external actor, not through military force, not through dramatic public declarations or emergency summits, through three specific things it has done quietly, consistently, and with remarkable discipline since this war began. The first thing is economic. China has kept Iran alive. Before this war started, Iran was exporting approximately 1.68 million barrels of oil per day. In March, at the height of the conflict, with Hormuz effectively choked and an American-led blockade officially in place, Iran was exporting 1.84 million barrels per day, more than before the war, more oil moving out of Iran during an American military and economic assault than was moving before it began. How does that happen? The answer is what analysts are calling China's dark fleet, tankers operating with spoofed transponders, ship-to-ship transfers conducted in international waters near Malaysia, payment in yuan through second-tier Chinese banks that bypass the SWIFT network entirely, the global financial system through which American sanctions actually operate. Satellite tracking data shows that 11.7 million barrels of Iranian crude have moved to China since this war began. The blockade Trump announced was not designed to reach that system. Some analysts believe it was deliberately structured not to. The second thing is diplomatic. China has kept Iran protected. When America proposed a UN Security Council resolution authorizing force to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, China and Russia vetoed it. When Europe attempted to use the snapback mechanism to reimpose UN nuclear sanctions on Iran, China blocked the Security Council from even considering it. When American allies around the world looked for multilateral support for the blockade, not a single country joined. China's diplomatic cover for Iran has been total, consistent, and effective. And throughout the conflict, China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi made 26 phone calls to key players. Iran was always on the list. The third thing is the one that connects directly to what happened today. China pressed Iran to open Hormuz. Wang Yi called Iranian Foreign Minister Araghchi directly. That call produced Friday's announcement that the Strait of Hormuz was open. Trump posted "thank you" in capital letters. Markets surged. Oil prices dropped 9% in a single session. And then America kept the blockade on Iranian ports. Iran reimposed restrictions on Hormuz. IRGC gunboats fired on a tanker. And China, the country that had architected the opening, the country that had made the call that moved the markets, said absolutely nothing about the closing. Sit with that sequence for a moment because it matters. China pressed Iran to open Hormuz. Iran opened Hormuz. America kept the blockade. Iran closed Hormuz again. And China, which had been the architect of the opening, offered no public reaction to the closing whatsoever. Here is what explains that. And it comes from a statement that China's Defense Minister Dong Jun made when the blockade was first announced. I want you to hear his exact words because they are worth more than 1,000 press briefings. He said, "We have trade and energy agreements with Iran. We expect others not to interfere in our affairs. The Strait of Hormuz is open to us." Open to us, not open in principle, not open as a matter of international law or freedom of navigation. Open to us. China drew a boundary around its own ships and its own commercial interests, not a boundary around the principle of free navigation, not a boundary around Iran's right to sovereignty under international law, a boundary around China's refineries, China's tankers, China's supply chains. The strait is open for China's business. Everyone else, every other country, every other set of ships, every other commercial interest can figure it out. That statement tells you China's actual position with extraordinary precision. China is not trying to resolve this conflict. China is managing its exposure to this conflict. And the distance between those two things is enormous, and it is growing every day. Now let me connect China's silence today to what it actually means strategically. Because this is the analytical insight I think most coverage is missing entirely. America's silence in response to Iran's refusal to negotiate communicates something very specific to Beijing. It communicates that America has not figured out how to make Iran come to the table. Think about it. The military pressure has not made Iran talk. The economic blockade has not made Iran talk. The ceasefire deadline has not made Iran talk. 21 hours of the most high-level direct diplomacy in 50 years did not make Iran talk. And today, Iran told its own most invested mediator, Pakistan, the country that has put more diplomatic capital into this process than anyone, that it will not return to the table without a written framework. China is watching all of this. China has been watching the entire sequence from the beginning, and what China reads in America's ongoing silence is a confirmation of something it suspected from the very start of this conflict. America's tools, military force, economic blockade, diplomatic pressure through carefully cultivated intermediaries are not sufficient to force a resolution on Iran. Not because America is weak, because Iran has enough external support to absorb American pressure without collapsing. And the external support Iran has is overwhelmingly, structurally, deliberately Chinese. The Jerusalem Post captured America's actual hope with clinical precision in its analysis of the blockade situation. It wrote that Washington is banking on one specific scenario. China uses its leverage as Iran's sole meaningful paying customer to pressure Tehran toward a deal. The logic goes that Iran will ignore American threats, but Iran will pay attention when its only serious buyer calls and says, "Take the terms before Tuesday or face consequences you cannot manage." That is America's hope. China calls Iran and says, "Make the deal." The problem is China has not done that. China pressed Iran to open Hormuz, a move that served China's direct commercial interest in having oil physically flow to its refineries. China did not press Iran to make nuclear concessions. China did not press Iran to accept American terms on uranium enrichment. And when Iran refused Pakistan's invitation to return to talks today, China did not press Iran to reconsider. China said nothing, and China's nothing is not an accident. It is not an oversight. It is not paralysis or indecision or bureaucratic diplomatic delay, it is a policy. Here is the structural reason China's silence serves China better than pushing Iran to deal. If Iran makes a comprehensive agreement with America, a deal that ends this war, reopens Hormuz permanently under terms Washington can accept, and includes meaningful nuclear constraints on Iran's enrichment program, several things change, and all of them are bad for China. First, Iran becomes less dependent on China. A post-deal Iran with sanctions relief, unfrozen assets, and access to Western financial systems and Western markets does not need to sell its oil at a steep discount to Chinese refineries. It can sell to anyone. China loses its decade-long position as Iran's sole meaningful customer, and all the strategic leverage that comes with being someone's only lifeline. Second, America emerges from this conflict having demonstrated something dangerous from China's perspective. That American military and economic pressure tools can, in combination, produce a nuclear deal in the Middle East. That precedent matters enormously for China, which is watching very closely how America applies pressure to other countries, and is aware that some of those pressure tools could eventually be aimed in China's direction. Third, the disruption in global energy markets that this conflict has generated, the reshaping of supply chains, the acceleration of clean energy demand, the structural changes that have benefited Chinese exports of solar panels, batteries, and electric vehicles ends. The crisis that China has been quietly and handsomely profiting from stops. China does not need this war to end badly for Iran, and China does not need this war to end badly for America either. What China wants, what actually serves China's long-term strategic interest, is for this war to continue long enough that the structural changes it has produced become permanent features of the emerging world order. The new alignments, the new energy dependencies, the new demonstration of American military resource consumption. And then, at the moment of China's choosing, Beijing can be the country that finally brokers the deal that ends it, on terms that reflect China's position as the indispensable power in the 21st century. That is the game China is playing, and it is playing it with remarkable patience and discipline. Now, I want to be fair. I do not want you to simply accept everything I am arguing without testing it, so let me make the strongest possible case for the American position, because it deserves a genuine hearing. The American argument goes like this: the pressure is working. Iran's economy is under real and significant strain. The rial has dropped 15%. The central bank is warning of a 12-year economic recovery timeline. Iran's own government damage assessment has reached up to $1 trillion. That is not nothing. That is a country feeling genuine pain. And the diplomatic process, despite today's setback, is still alive. The ceasefire has held on the main Iran-US front. Even as Hormuz fluctuates, Iran came 80% of the way to a deal in Islamabad, the closest the two countries have come in half a century. The Lebanon ceasefire removed one of Iran's key preconditions for a broader agreement. Pakistan, Egypt, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia are all still working. Progress has happened, real measurable progress. And Trump's instinct, maximize pressure before the deadline, then offer a face-saving exit, has genuine historical precedent. It is, in important ways, how Reagan approached Soviet negotiations. Escalate the pressure until the other side concludes that a deal is better than continued pain, and then give them a dignified way to say yes. This argument is not wrong about the facts. The pressure is real. The process is still alive. Movement has happened. But here is what the American argument cannot account for. Every round of pressure has produced movement up to a point, and then stalled. Because the point at which Iran cannot absorb any more pressure is further out than America's tools can actually reach. As long as China is buying 1.84 million barrels of Iranian oil per day through a system specifically designed to be structurally unreachable by American sanctions and blockades, Iran has economic oxygen. Not comfort, not prosperity, not a thriving economy. Oxygen. Just enough to breathe, just enough to refuse, just enough to tell Pakistan not yet, just enough to fire gunboats at a tanker while ceasefire talks are supposedly imminent. America's pressure strategy is built around squeezing a country that has a lifeline America cannot cut. The architecture of that lifeline was built deliberately over years, precisely for this kind of moment. And the country holding that lifeline today chose silence. So where does this go? Let me tell you what I think the next 72 hours will actually show, because the sequence of events before Tuesday's deadline will tell us more about where this conflict is heading than anything being said publicly by anyone right now. There are three specific signals to watch. The first is whether China makes any public move in the next 24 hours. If Wang Yi picks up the phone, calls Araghchi, and presses Iran back to the table, that is China making a calculation. A deal right now serves China better than the current strategic limbo. It would signal that Beijing believes it has extracted enough value from this crisis and is ready to assume the role of the dealmaker, to step onto the world stage as the power that ended the war on terms it helped shape. That would be a significant moment in the history of this conflict and, honestly, in the history of this century. If China stays silent, if another 24 hours passes with no statement, no call, no signal, that is China calculating it needs more time, more structural change, more permanent realignment, more of whatever this crisis is producing that China finds valuable. The second signal is what America does or does not say about China's role directly. Secretary Rubio is currently meeting with European partners. The planned Trump-Xi summit in May is still on the schedule. If America begins explicitly naming China's weapons transfers, China's oil purchases, and China's systematic diplomatic obstruction as components of the Iran problem in its public statements, if American officials start treating this as the three-player game that it actually is, that is a significant shift. That is America finally deciding to play the game as it exists rather than the game it wishes existed. If America keeps addressing Iran as if China is not in the room, keeps designing its pressure tools as if the Chinese lifeline does not exist, keeps having press briefings that discuss the ceasefire deadline without mentioning who is giving Iran the oxygen to keep saying no, that is America playing the game while pretending the most important player is not at the table. The third signal is what Iran says to Pakistan in the next 48 hours. Iran's stated position today is no talks without a framework. If Pakistan can produce a written outline, some document, however preliminary, however carefully worded, that lets Iran save face on enrichment while giving America something real and verifiable on stockpiles, Iran may come back. The framework question is not impossible to answer. It is difficult, but it is not impossible. If the framework question goes unanswered, if the next 48 hours pass without any written proposal that Iran can point to as a basis for returning, the ceasefire expires Tuesday with no deal in sight, and Trump faces the decision he has been successfully avoiding since this whole process began. Resume bombing a country whose economy is under pressure, but whose resolve, backed by Chinese oxygen, remains intact, or extend a ceasefire that is already being violated at sea and that no one believes is sustainable. Neither option looks good. Both options carry enormous risk, and both options look worse if China has been deliberately engineering this moment. Let me bring everything together because I want to leave you with the clearest possible picture of what today actually means. Iran refused to talk today. America said talks are happening this weekend. China said nothing. Those three facts, placed side by side, tell you the actual state of this war more accurately than any press briefing, any presidential post, any diplomatic statement from any capital. Iran refused because its trust deficit with America is real, documented, and supported by a consistent pattern of broken agreements stretching back to 2018. When Ghalibaf says his delegation came within inches of a deal before the terms shifted, he is not spinning a loss for domestic consumption. He is describing something that U.S. officials privately confirmed. Iran is not refusing because it wants this war to continue. Iran is refusing because it has specific, rational, evidence-based reasons not to trust that any agreement it signs will still exist in 2 years. America claimed talks are happening because its domestic political position requires projecting forward momentum on a conflict that has now consumed more than $18 billion and counting. Saying the negotiations are stalled, saying Iran said no, saying the ceasefire might expire without a deal, none of that is a viable domestic narrative, so America projects confidence and calls it diplomacy. And China said nothing because China's silence is its policy, because that silence is a message being transmitted directly to Tehran, and the message is this: you do not have to negotiate on terms you do not accept. We are still buying. The contracts are still honored. The tankers are still moving. The yuan payments are still clearing. America's blockade is designed to squeeze Iran until Iran talks. China's silence is designed to give Iran enough oxygen that it does not have to talk on America's terms. One move and one deliberate non-move. both calculated, both serving a long-term strategic vision. And the ceasefire expires in 3 days. Watch what China does not say in the next 72 hours. Because in this conflict, from the very beginning, the most important statements have never been the ones made at press conferences or posted on social media or delivered in carefully prepared remarks to the United Nations. They have been the ones carefully, deliberately, and strategically not made. Today, China's silence told Iran everything it needs to know about whether to go back to the table. If you want to push back on any of this, and I genuinely hope you do, because this analysis is better when it gets tested, read what Galibaf said after Islamabad, not the headline, the full statement. Read China's defense minister's statement about the strait being open to us. Read the Jerusalem Post's analysis about America banking on China to pressure Iran into a deal. Read Iran's deputy foreign minister's statement today about the framework precondition. Read all of it and then ask the question that nobody in Washington is asking at any press briefing, in any hearing room, in any public forum. If China is the reason Iran can afford to say no today, then China went silent on the day Iran said it. Which of those two facts is doing more actual work in this negotiation? Because I think the answer to that question is the answer to where this war goes next. Sources cited: Galibaf post-Islamabad statement, China Defense Minister Dong Jun's statement on Hormuz, Jerusalem Post blockade analysis, Reuters sourcing on 80% progress, Axios mediator confidence reporting, Iranian Deputy Foreign Minister statement on framework precondition, satellite tracking data on Iranian oil exports.